This week, I read Adam Grant's Think Again. And this is a book that it just came out, actually. I think it's from 2021. It came out earlier this year. Um, and when I started reading it, came into it thinking that it would be very similar to Adam Grant's other books. And I think that it is, actually. Grant's written Originals, How Nonconformists Move the World, and also wrote Give and Take, a revolutionary approach to success. I believe it was Give and Take. That was his first book back in about 2013 or so. I read that book and really don't remember a whole lot about it because I don't know that it really made a big impact on me. But Grant's a top rated professor. He's a best selling author. He's written, I think, 5 books now, uh, including a couple others that I think Originals and Option B, and there was another one, Power Moves, I think. Uh, and they get a lot of attention. They get a lot of attention among a crowd of people that I don't know that I'm quite in. And so I feel like I'm always missing something whenever I am looking at or thinking about one of Grant's books. This one is, a perfectly respectable length. It's about a couple hundred pages, good sourced notes in the back. And I made quite a few notes in this, and I just wanted to read a couple of different sections about it. The gist of this book is, how do you let your insecurities or your ego influence you? And how do you keep those things from making you biased in your thinking? I think that if you could sum this up, I would say this book takes a new angle on the "that's how we've always done it" approach to everything, right? To your life, to your business, and mostly to business. But he has examples in here, and it takes the pretty familiar route of sourcing some examples from some places, and some of them I don't think are particularly effective for most people at most scale. I think that if you're a small business owner or a freelancer, or you run a small nonprofit, I don't know that comparing yourself to the Gates Foundation or Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth, which is another example that he gave in here, is much. It's going to help you much in your endeavors in life, but you know, to each their own, I suppose. Uh, so one of the things that I wanted to start off with was this bit here about the smarter they are, the harder they fail. And he writes, and I quote, "Mental horsepower doesn't guarantee mental dexterity. No matter how much brain power you have, if you lack the motivation to change your mind, you'll miss many occasions to think again. Research reveals that the higher you score on an IQ test, the more likely you are to fall for stereotypes because you're faster at recognizing patterns. And recent experiments suggest the smarter you are, the more you might struggle to update your beliefs." I think that's totally fair. Uh, when I read this, I remembered an old political science professor of mine when I studied at IU who said that stereotypes were just things that people observed in nature. The stereotypes became stereotypes precisely because they were so observable, that people utilized stereotypes to sort of develop patterns about certain groups of things. And we've since evolved to make this more about people, and we think about them as stereotypes of people, but you could think about recognizing the patterns from sort of a caveman era, that certain kinds of growls or grunts or howls or sounds from the bushes might indicate a sense of danger. And so he goes on to say, one study investigated whether being a math whiz makes you better at analyzing data. The answer is yes, if you're told the data are about something bland, like a treatment for skin rashes. But what if the exact same data are labeled as focusing on an ideological issue that activates strong emotions, like gun laws in the United States? Being a quant jock makes you more accurate in interpreting the results as long as they support your beliefs. Yet if the empirical pattern clashes with your ideology, math prowess is no longer an asset. It actually becomes a liability. The better you are at crunching numbers, the more spectacularly you fail at analyzing patterns that contradict your views. If they were liberals, math geniuses did worse than their peers at evaluating evidence that gun bans failed. If they were conservatives, they did worse at assessing evidence that gun bans worked. Again, I read this and I get the point that he's driving at, that in psychology there are biases that drive patterns, and this is his intro into confirmation bias. And he goes on to say that the other bias in this is the "I'm not biased" bias, in which people believe that their more objective than others. And it turns out that smart people are more likely to fall into this trap, he writes. He says, the brighter you are, the harder it can be to see your own limitations. Being good at thinking can make you worse at rethinking. And I totally get his point here. I also look at this and I recognize that this might be oversimplifying some things a little bit. I think that in the notion of the gun bans, I think that this assumes no gray area, and I think that when you get into some very touchy topics within politics, the thing that makes them so sticky as political issues is precisely because they have gray area, right? And that gun bans, for better or worse, introduce changes in an environment that some people can rightly or not perceive as good or bad. And I think this sort of oversimplifies some of this a little bit. But he goes on to say that when we're in scientist mode and that we should think like scientists, we refuse to let our ideas become ideologies. We don't start with answers or solutions. We lead with questions and puzzles. We don't preach from intuition. We teach from evidence. We don't just have healthy skepticism about other people's arguments. We dare to disagree with our own arguments. And I think that's a reasonable thing. I think more people would be better off if we could do that more reasonably as a people. But again, sticky political issues being what they are sticky political issues. Moving on, I wanted to cite another thing in here. This is from page 91 in a chapter called The Good Fight Club. And he writes in the subheading there, getting hot without getting mad. A major problem with task conflict is that it often spills over into relationship conflict. One minute you're disagreeing about how much seasoning to put on the Thanksgiving turkey, the next minute you find yourself yelling, "You smell." Although the Wright brothers, and this is an example that he gave here about Orville and Wilbur Wright and how they were incredibly mad at each other sometimes, and that somebody had described them as really disagreeable to each other, but somehow through some, familial brotherly love, they were never violent towards each other. They were what we would consider passionately angry about what they thought was sort of the best design for a wing or the best design for a propeller. And so he goes into this talking about the airplane propeller. And he says, although the Wright brothers had a lifetime of experience discovering each other's hot buttons, that didn't mean they always kept their cool. Their last grand challenge before liftoff was the single hardest problem, designing a propeller. They knew their airplane couldn't take flight without one, but the right kind didn't exist. As they struggled with various approaches, they argued back and forth for hours at a time, often raising their voices. The feuding lasted for months as each took turns preaching the merits of his own solutions and prosecuting the other's points. Eventually, their younger sister, Catherine, threatened to leave the house if they didn't stop fighting. They kept at it anyway until one night it culminated in what might have been the loudest shouting match of their lives. But strangely, the next morning they came into the shop and acted as if nothing happened. They picked up the argument about the propeller right where they left off, only now without the yelling. Soon they were both rethinking their assumptions and stumbling onto what would become one of the world's biggest breakthroughs. And he goes on to say that they were masters at having intense task conflict without relationship conflict. And as a solopreneur, I don't work with a lot of other people necessarily, and when I do, they're usually directly with the clients that I'm working with. But I can see how that might relate to some people who have clashes with their colleagues. However, in the environments that I've worked in, maybe this is just my Midwestern roots showing, I don't know a lot of people who get really rootin' tootin' mad at their colleagues a lot. I think people can kind of get upset with them, or more likely they might just not like them so much. They just have a personality type that runs them the wrong way, or they just sort of find them as unhelpful or kind of lazy or some other situation there. I don't know. But at any rate, I don't know that necessarily applies to a lot of people. It didn't really apply to me, and so I thought it was an interesting story. But the Orville and Wilbur Wright are fascinating characters. Catherine, their sister, doesn't get nearly enough credit as she deserves for a lot of the work that she did. David McCullough has a book on the Wright brothers that I've read that is very, very good and is well worth the time to read, but that's a discussion for another day. There's also a part in the back in here, or at least the middle of the book anyway, I should say, in the chapter called Dances with Foes. There's a pyramid in here where he talks about the hierarchy of disagreement created by computer scientist Paul Graham. And the pyramid looks about like what you would expect from like a food pyramid, without all of the divisions on each level. And instead, there's, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 7 layers to this pyramid. And on the bottom is sort of the worst case scenario of how to refute an argument. This is things like name calling, saying something like you're an asshat. And then above that is ad hominem attacks, which these are things that attacks the characteristics or authority of the writer or the person making the point without addressing the substance of the argument. And the level above that is responding to tone. This is where you criticize the tone of the writing without addressing the substance. Like women, unfortunately, are often subjected to this, where a lot of men will just say, well, I just didn't like her tone when she said that to me. A level above that is contradiction. This is where you state the opposing case with little or no supporting evidence. This is starting to feel a little bit more like our political arguments that we have over family gatherings, doesn't it? Counter argument is above that. This is contradicts and then backs up the reasoning with supporting evidence. This can be things like statistics, quotes from people in authoritative positions. This is starting to sound a lot more like our vaccine debates in this country. Refutation, this is where you find the mistake and explain why it's mistaken in a central argument. Again, starting to sound a little bit more like our vaccine arguments in this country. And then refuting the central point, which is at the top. This is what we should all strive for when we are sort of making a claim against an argument. Refuting the central point just explicitly refutes the central point of a debate. And I look at this and I realize that this put into a visual hierarchy and a verbal hierarchy of something that I think I intuitively knew, but didn't fully understand. And so this may have been the thing that I kind of came away with the most impressed with in this book, about how to handle somebody when they become hostile. And I don't know that it's going to change a lot of minds. I think that I'm reminded of this morning. There was a New York Times poll that had asked people who are unvaccinated right now against COVID-19 what it would take to vaccinate them. And half of the unvaccinated said that there was nothing. There's nothing that would change their mind about that. And so I don't know that there's any sort of refutation there about this. I think this sort of gets into Seth Godin's old chestnut about tribes. And we start to devolve into sort of a party mentality of things. And the Times doesn't go into the discussion about it, but that also means that the other half of those unvaccinated people have something that would change their mind. So at least there might be some value there for some arguments some of the time. I just don't know that it does much for our current political discourse. There's a section in the back here as well about in the chapter called Bad Blood on the Diamond. And he talks about rivalries, like as we were just discussing about political rivalries. And he says, it's one thing to love your team. It's another to hate your rivals so much that you'd consider rooting for terrorists to crush them. If you despise a particular sports team and its fans, you're harboring some strong opinions about a group of people. Those beliefs are stereotypes, and they often spill over into prejudice. And the stronger your attitudes become, the less likely you are to rethink them. And the example that he gives in here is sports team rivalries like the LA Dodgers and the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees and the New England Patriots. I'm not a big sports person, so I don't have a lot of these mental states about these teams, but I recognize that there are some people who really just do not like some of these teams or don't like some of the players on those teams for one reason or another. But these rivalries aren't unique to sports. He goes on to write, a rivalry exists whenever we reserve special animosity for a group we see as competing with us for resources or threatening our identities. I think this would have done well to get back at the section that was about 2 chapters before this part of the book about how you refute central arguments, how this relates to our political discourse in this country. And he goes on to speak a little bit more about stereotypes again, which comes up a few times in this book. But the other thing that I wanted to think about regarding stereotypes is that stereotypes can be somewhat helpful. Again, thinking about my political science professor from IU 10 or 15 years ago, or how long it's been, stereotypes can be helpful at identifying threats. And in fact, if you are in a situation where you're being trained in, say, active shooter threat assessment, part of the training that a lot of law enforcement officers use is they're just looking for things that just sort of stand out as unusual or odd. Imagine somebody like wearing a coat indoors when it's not cold outside. Is somebody coming in with a lot of musical equipment? An example that was given to me not that long ago was, imagine that you're in a hospital and someone starts coming in with a lot of musical equipment cases. And to a trained security officer, that should sort of spark an alarm, particularly if they know that there is not sort of a music night planned, or that there's not somebody performing in the children's ward that day. Somebody coming in with a bunch of musical cases could be using them to smuggle in weapons. And you might argue, is like, well, that seems unlikely, and it probably is. But those stereotypes can be somewhat useful in there. I'm not defending stereotypes for the sake of stereotypes here. I'm just saying that there's a recognition in here that sometimes using stereotypes can be a useful way to help us frame our environment and our situation that can be helpful in our overall survival. I think we've evolved as people to utilize stereotypes for some of those very reasons. So, moving along in this book, again, on the topics of stereotypes, there's a stereotype timeline back here on page 135, where he gives the example in about 5 steps over a period of time. So imagine you're having an experience that a kid with a mohawk steals your bike. And so then you sort of form a stereotype that kids with mohawks are thieves. That's very simplistic, and I think most people, most of the time, can sort of make the connection that one kid with a mohawk doesn't necessarily mean that all kids with mohawks are bad, but it does begin to play on you if you had multiple bikes stolen by multiple different kids with mohawks. That might be a situation. It could be a gang affiliation thing too, if you don't think about it necessarily as kids, but as adults. But anyway, he goes on to say that, so yeah, you've formed the stereotype that kids with mohawks are thieves. Then your third step is that you're having a new experience with a kid with a mohawk who was nice to you. And then you start questioning the stereotype that maybe mohawk kids aren't so bad. And then the fifth and final stage of this is that questioning stereotypes in general is that you can't judge a kid by his cover. And we'll excuse the mixed metaphors on some of that, but I recognize that the kid with the mohawk and stealing your bike probably isn't a very useful example. I think it's very simplistic, but I think it would have been nice if he extrapolated on this to talk a little bit more about how people should probably rethink their stereotypes and their motivations behind race. Because I think that that's probably where we see this the most, particularly for people who just aren't around or exposed to some people some of the times. Like if you're not exposed to immigrants or, I don't know, Catholics or Black people or whoever it might be, some group of people, gays, whatever, that once you are, that's usually the best medicine for those people in terms of understanding that they're not all bad, and that getting out of a bubble is healthy for people to be able to develop as people professionally and personally. Moving on, he also talks back here about, in a section about vaccines, about vaccine whisperers and mild-mannered interrogators. That's the title of this chapter. And here's a story in here that really stuck out with me. This may have been one of my more favorite parts of this book. He says, years ago, I got a call asking for help from a biotechnology startup. The CEO, Jeff, was a scientist by training. He liked to have all the necessary data before making a decision. After more than a year and a half at the helm, he still hadn't rolled out a vision for the company, and it was in danger of failing. The trio of consultants tried to convince him to offer some direction, and he fired them all. Before the head of HR threw in the towel, she threw a Hail Mary pass and contacted an academic. It was the perfect time for a motivational interview. The academic he's talking about here is himself. Jeff seemed reluctant to change, and I had no idea why. When we met, I decided to see if I could help him find his motivation to change. Here are the pivotal moments from our conversation. Me. I really enjoy being the guy who gets hired after 3 consultants get fired. I'd love to hear how they screwed this up. Jeff. The first consultant gave me answers instead of asking questions. That was arrogant. How could he solve a problem before he'd even taken the time to understand it? The next 2 did a better job learning from me, but they still ended up trying to tell me how to do my job. Me. So why did you bother to bring in another outsider? Jeff. I'm looking for some fresh ideas on leadership. Me. It's not my place to tell you how to lead. What does leadership mean to you? Jeff. making systematic decisions, having a well thought out strategy. Me, are there any leaders you admire for those qualities? Jeff, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Steve Jobs. And he goes on to say that this was a turning point in his interview because he was using what is called motivational interviewing. And there's a distinction between um, discussing something with people where they can sort of sustain the status quo and talking to people where they are in a mindset to sort of change their actions or their thinking. Sustained talk, he actually says, is commentary about maintaining the status quo, and change talk is referencing a desire, ability, need, or commitment to make adjustments. When contemplating a change, many people are ambivalent. They have some reasons to consider it, but also some reasons to stay the course. Miller and Rolnick, some of the researchers that he cites earlier on, suggest asking about and listening for change talk, and then posing some questions about why and how they might change. And he goes on to talk about how he helped this company and recognizes at the end, too, that the company actually ultimately did fail. But I think this is probably the most useful point in here because it's an example of something that anybody can relate to. I think we've all either worked for somebody or know a company or know a business that somebody else works for, where the leader of that organization doesn't really have a vision in the mental sense or the leadership qualities to make a business successful. And I look at that and I think to myself, part of some of the problem with vision and mission and people becoming enamored by, growing a business is that there's this mentality that it's got to be one right thing, right? Like there's just like a series of, create your own adventure steps and that there's some path that will always lead to success. And I think one of the things that misses the point in this section of the book is that while he's talking about motivational interviewing and helping people kind of overcome the way they're thinking about things, it also does not recognize that maybe not every business is a good idea, right? That not everybody is good at their job. Not everybody is, on to a good idea about something. They have a lousy product maybe, or they just don't have something that actually solves people's problems in a useful way. And I think that's missing from this, and I wish he had talked about that a little bit more, but he doesn't. But it's still an interesting story in there and worth looking at. He also talks here towards the end of the book on page 194 and 195 about in a chapter called Rewriting the Textbook. And he talks about a professor named Robert Nozick. And one of Nozick's ideas became famous thanks to the movie The Matrix. And in the 1970s, he introduced a thought experiment about whether people would choose to enter, quote, an experience machine that could provide infinite pleasure but remove them from real life. And he predicted that most of us would ditch the machine because we value doing and being, not just experience, and because we wouldn't want to limit our experiences to what humans could imagine and simulate. I mentioned this because this particular story isn't that interesting, but the footnotes in this book are interesting. This is a book that has footnotes directly in the bottom of the pages in a handful of spots, and they are absolutely worth reading, and I think some of the more interesting bits of thought in the whole book. But he also goes on to talk about this research study from this professor, and he says in part here, as they started working on the project, I noticed a surprising pattern. And he's talking about a project where students are in a semester-long class wrestling over some bit of problem or challenge that has been proposed in the scientific community. He says the students who struggled the most were the straight A students, the perfectionists. It turns out that although perfectionists are more likely than their peers to ace school, they don't perform any better than their colleagues at work. This tracks with evidence that, across a wide range of industries, grades are not a strong predictor of job performance. Achieving excellence in school often requires mastering old ways of thinking. Building an influential career demands new ways of thinking. In a classic study of highly accomplished architects, the most creative ones graduated with a B average. Their straight A counterparts were so determined to be right that they often failed to take the risk of rethinking the orthodoxy. A similar pattern emerged in a study of students who graduated at the top of their class. Quote, valedictorians aren't likely to be future visionaries, education researcher Karen Arnold explains. They typically settle into the system instead of shaking it up. And that stuck out to me. I wasn't a straight A student, but I was close to it. I just struggled with math mostly. And I get this, right? This we know these kinds of students. Maybe you were one of them that straight A students can be terrified of being wrong, and we need to encourage people to take some risks sometimes and incentivize students to sort of develop that muscle in their minds about how to take risks. And this moves on as well into a nice little summary about uh, careers, right? Because we talk about students that are straight A students and how they sort of settle into careers as basically middle managers, I think is what we can say. And there's a section back here in a chapter called Escaping Tunnel Vision where he writes, "We don't have to upend our entire paths to rethink some of our plans. Some people are perfectly content with their fields of work, but dissatisfied with their current roles. Others may be too risk averse to make a geographic move for a job or a partner, and many don't have the luxury of making a pivot. Being economically dependent on a job or emotionally attached to an extended family can limit the options available. Whether or not we have the opportunity or appetite for major changes in our lives, it's still possible to make smaller adjustments that breathe new meaning into our days." My colleagues, Amy Rezinwisky and Jane Dutton, find that in every line of work, there are people who become active architects of their own jobs. And this is me talking here. I think this is probably the central nut of this book. They rethink their roles through job crafting, changing their daily actions to better fit their values, interests, and skills. One of the places Amy and Jane studied job crafting was in the University of Michigan healthcare system. If you visited a certain floor of the hospital, it wouldn't be long before cancer patients told you how grateful they were for Candace Walker. Her mission was not only to protect their fragile immune systems, it was also to care for their fragile emotions. She called the chemotherapy center the House of Hope. Candace was often the first one to console families when their loved ones went through treatment. She showed up with bagels and coffee, and she would make patients laugh by telling them stories about her cats during drinking her milk or showing them that she had accidentally put on one brown sock and one blue sock that day. One day she saw a patient on the floor of an elevator writhing in pain, and the staff members nearby weren't sure what to do. Which, me talking here, isn't that a little weird that a person's on the floor and the staff members don't know what to do in a hospital? Anyway, Candace immediately took charge, rushed the woman into a wheelchair, and took her up the elevator for urgent treatment. The patient later called her, quote, "my savior." Candace Walker wasn't a doctor or a nurse. She wasn't a social worker either. She was a custodian, and her official job was to keep the cancer center clean. Candace and her fellow custodians were all hired to do the same job, but some of them ended up rethinking their roles. One cleaner on a long-term intensive care unit took it upon herself to regularly rearrange the paintings on the walls, hoping that a change of scenery might spark some awareness among patients in comas. When asked about it, she said, quote, "No, it's not part of my job, but it is part of me." I think that's fascinating. I think it's an enlightening, uplifting story. I think we all can look at that or hear that and say that's how we should all be in our jobs. I think it's another thing entirely to be empowered for this. There's a lot of research that I've been reading lately about how it's not money that makes people excited about their jobs, it's the autonomy that they have within their jobs. And I think that most people would do well if they hear something like that and they just cannot figure out a way to reframe their mindset about what it is that they're doing, that maybe the job that you have isn't right for you because you don't have the autonomy to be able to control even the smallest bits about how you think about your job and your work. Anyway, at the end of the book, just real quickly here, there is a whole section of summary in the back about actions for impact. And if you're interested in working on your rethinking skills, he says, here are my top 30 practical takeaways. I'm not going to read all of them, but one of them is to think like a scientist, define your identity in terms of values and not opinions, seek out information that goes against your views, beware of getting stranded at a summit of Mount Stupid. This was a section where he talked about confusing competence with competence. Harness the benefits of doubt, embrace the joy of being wrong, don't shy away from constructive conflict, be a better listener, have a conversation with people, reinforce freedom of choice, acknowledge common ground, don't shy away from caveats and contingencies, expand your emotional range, rethink your actions and not just your surrounding, schedule a life checkup, which is something that I think is becoming popular amongst people interested in sort of self-care about things. Make time to think again, which is a useful one. That was actually number 30 on his list, and I think is probably one of the most important things. Uh, my favorite author, David McCullough, when asked how he writes his book, he always replies with some nugget about how people want to know, like how much time he spends writing or researching, and does he divide up his time formulaically, where like I do 60% research and 40% writing, or how much of this time is revision versus the first draft. And he says, nobody ever asked me how much time I spend thinking. I think we would all do well to sort of make time to think again, as Adam Grant suggests. Overall, I think this book was intended for an audience that wasn't necessarily me, as sort of an individual solopreneur consultant type, but I think that for a lot of people who are in mid to larger level organizations, this could probably be very helpful. It's comes from a place of a little privilege, I think, because you've got to be in a I think your most value is probably going to come if you have at least some autonomy or control in your position, either over other people or yourself. And so if you're not in sort of a middle management or upper management position, or if you're not running a business or an organization, that most of this is probably going to seem a little out of place in your life. But overall, the writing of this was easy and breezy. You could read this in probably a weekend if you really put your mind to it. And overall, I gave it 3 stars on Goodread out of 5.